Hi everyone, I'm Marilou Hamer, founder of Rosy Earnest, a transparent fine fragrance brand built around ingredient transparency and higher safety standards. I'm speaking with Lindsay Dahl, who's an author, advocate, and one of the leading voices in the conversation around safer products, ingredient transparency, and consumer awareness. In her book, Cleaning House, which I highly recommend, Lindsay explores these questions through more than 2 decades of work in environmental health, public policy, and consumer safety, including helping pass over 30 state and federal laws. I'm excited to have a conversation with her about transparency, trust, misinformation, regulation, and what doing better actually looks like. So, before we jump into the bigger conversation, I'd love to start a little bit more personally. What first pulled you into this space?
Well, thanks for having me here and for all of your good work. I know it's incredibly hard to challenge not only the existing industry, but think about a new way to formulate products. So,
Mhm.
on the personal level, I kind of stumbled into this issue. I was, fresh out of college, and I really cared about sustainability and protecting the environment. And as you know, when you're young, you don't have a lot of experience, and the job market was kind of tough in the early 2000s. But I applied for a role maybe 1 or 2 years out of college that was focused on environmental health. And what I saw was a consumer safety role because the work was about getting toxic chemicals out of baby and kids products.
Mhm.
And I was 22, 23 at the time. And I was like, I don't want to think like baby products is like the last thing I want to think about. That doesn't sound like a cool job.
Yeah.
But I needed work. So I said yes. And I quickly fell into this issue in a way that was really powerful, where I started to understand that the same toxic chemicals that were in kids' products, and as I soon would find out, many products in our home, is the same toxic chemicals that ended up as environmental pollution.
Right.
So, toxic chemical pollution in our drinking water, in our food, in the air we breathe. And I realized, oh, wow, if we can use this issue and connection that people have with their consumer products as an emotional connection to caring about larger sustainability issues, this could actually be a really powerful way into the conversation for people that maybe didn't care about the bugs and birds and ecosystems that they couldn't see in their own backyard. So
Mhm.
I found that journey to be really powerful, and here I am over 20 years later.
Or how do you feel about the word clean beauty or clean living today? Do you think it's kind of become a dirty word?
I don't. I think people have tried to make it seem like it's a dirty word
Mhm.
because the field of environmental health science, whatever you want to call it, clean living, is becoming politicized like many things due to social media. But if you look at the history, especially in the beauty industry, before clean beauty, it was natural beauty. And then the kind of incumbents really kind of went against and tried to discredit natural beauty. There's all of these terms that it's like whatever the buzzy thing is, people love to hate. And that's what I see with clean beauty. So at the end of the day, consumer research and sentiment continues to show that more and more people care about
Yep.
choosing and shopping with brands that are making better decisions about the safety of ingredients. That's not going to go away. So if we change how it's marketed and what it's called, fine.
Mhm.
But I think there's a pretty organized effort, especially on social media, to try to discredit this as something that's fringe or pseudoscience or not grounded in real science. And we've seen this playbook before. If you look back to the tobacco industry, when we tried to ban lead from gasoline, certainly when we were trying to ban BPA from baby bottles in the early
Yep.
2000s, this is a playbook that's been done over and over. So I think we should all kind of stay the course and follow the science.
In your book, I really resonated with what you were saying about how social media really amplified both misinformation and polarization. Can you elaborate on that?
I wrote a book about toxic chemical pollution in our homes, but I end up talking about how social media is the most toxic thing in our homes.
Yeah.
And the reason for that, it's also the reason that I wrote the book Cleaning House. It's not just about cleaning our house of certain products, it's about cleaning it's a metaphor for a lot of different things. Cleaning house for our government, for our own hearts and minds, and also just like how we consume information. I really saw these kind of factions emerging, which is really designed by these algorithms that promote content that is polarizing, or it incentivizes people to create salacious headlines whether it's dismissing this as an issue that's not real or fear mongering and kind of overstating the science.
Yeah.
And the reality is that the algorithms have been promoting this and kind of fueling this divide. And the more, I mean, I've been working across all 50 states in a totally bipartisan fashion for now 2 decades. And this has always been a bipartisan issue. The majority of people can see and understand the nuance about really
Mhm.
complex science. And also, we have consistent polling that shows that American voters, especially women, are willing to kind of like flip political parties if people are
Mhm.
voting against the interest of removing these toxic chemicals. And so today, I think the polarization is a manufactured polarization that comes from social media. And again, I wanted to write a book. You know, people are like, oh, I wasn't just going to like try to fight fire with fire
Yeah.
by, I could have shifted and spent all my time on social media. But I really felt like this story and the credibility of the science in this movement deserved written word in a analog book. And
Mhm.
that's why I hope people pick up a copy of it or, you know, get it from your local library to kind of sink into the nuance of this issue. Because I think most people are actually in the middle road, which I call the pragmatists.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that really resonated with me because as a brand, I think it's a really fine line also between trying to educate and being accused of fear-mongering. Another thing that I thought that was really interesting is what you describe as a war between old and new science. Can you elaborate?
So a lot of the arguments that I have seen the chemical industry make, whether I was, you know, testifying in support of a bill to ban toxic chemicals, certainly in their press releases over the years, is that they go back to this old phrase from traditional toxicology, which is, don't worry about this. The levels are too low. The dose makes the poison. And the problem with that is that framework of understanding the safety of chemicals or poisons, as it was for toxicology, is how much of something can you be exposed to before harm happens.
Mhm.
And that scientific philosophy, which I call the old science, sometimes has applications in today's world, but oftentimes doesn't. And it's not reflective of the science dating back to the 1930s that show us in some cases with certain ingredients like hormone disrupting chemicals, which are certainly relevant for the fragrance industry,
Yep.
actually work and have harmful impacts at lower levels. And so the new science is actually not new. You know, like I said, this is dating back to the 1920s and 1930s, where we have scientific evidence showing us that a lot of chemicals behave differently than we originally expected them to. The
Mhm.
other thing is that these scientific concepts have been debated within the scientific community for a long time. However, the scientific consensus around environmental health sciences and what I call new science has really grown. So, scientific consensus is like, oh, there's not one or two studies here or there. There's been
Mhm.
so many peer reviewed research from really credible top tier journals
Yeah.
replicated over decades that there's now consensus to say, yes, we know that hormone disrupting chemicals work at lower levels. And so I think it's very, again, easy to go back where a lot of people are receiving their information from social media to kind
Mhm.
of go back to these like simplified, oh, the dose makes the poison, don't worry about it. But really, the science is much more complicated, and we need to be able to apply what today's modern science tells us about chemical safety in order to inform our consumer choices and how we decide to regulate chemicals.
Right. And can you tell me a little bit more about what you call or what is called the precautionary approach? Sorry, I'm French speaking, so some of my words
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
The precautionary principle or the precautionary approach to formulating a product or to passing laws and policy is basically a better safe than sorry approach.
Right.
That's the simplest way to describe the precautionary approach, but I like to give an example. So if you've got a fragrance that has an ingredient that in studies has been linked to hormone disruption, and then you've got another fragrance that doesn't, which one are you going to choose? And the majority of people would choose, if cost wasn't an option and
Mhm.
access wasn't an option, they would choose the one that doesn't have any ingredients linked to hormone disruption. And so that's basically, we've got, over 12,000 ingredients that are used to formulate beauty and personal care products. And there's a lot of data gaps. So a lot of them have not been studied adequately for us to be able to
Mhm.
understand. And it's a formula or a lens when you're bringing products to market to say, hey, if we don't have enough data to show that this is actually safe, let's find a different ingredient to use that does have robust data showing its safety. And so this approach is how the European Union has taken its regulation. And I think it's definitely the best way for us to assume that products are safe. The thing I also really like about the precautionary approach is it's not just about the safety of the person using the product. It's
Mhm.
about and thinks about the entire life cycle of that toxic chemical. So in today's world where people are saying, oh, don't worry about all these like safe buying lists, like whatever, everything's fine, is actually really dismissing the impacts to communities living next
Mhm.
to the manufacturing facilities, making those toxic chemicals, the workers who work within those factories. They're called fence line communities that are traditionally communities of color or low income communities here in the United States.
Mhm.
And it fails to account for the entire life cycle of that particular toxic chemical. So that's one of the reasons that I like the precautionary approach is it's a holistic way for us to think about, hey, if we can actually shift the way we think about safety, maybe not just products, but the entire global ecosystem can actually be healthier.
I completely agree. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to use that approach and also work with the environmental working group to ensure that our products were to respecting, the strictest science that was available out. I know you've worked for several years with Beauty Counter, and that you helped pass a lot of the laws making the beauty industry safer. Fragrance, it's still considered as a trade secret. So why do you think transparency is so important, and what changes for consumers when they have visibility into what's in a product?
If consumers know what's in their product, they can make the choice of
Mhm.
which brand they want to support. Without that information and transparency, it's a black box and you can't compare products apples to apples.
Mhm.
So it's interesting because if there weren't any issues with health concerns in chemicals used in fragrances, the lack of transparency wouldn't matter, but that's not the case.
Yeah.
So we've got a bunch of decades worth of peer-reviewed science showing that many of the ingredients, not all, but many ingredients used in fragrances have links to whether it's disrupting the hormone system or they're allergens for people. Some people are really sensitive to different types of fragrance ingredients,
Yeah.
and they need to be able to navigate the market effectively. And if I think about the early days of Beauty Counter in like 2013, 2014, it was really unusual to have fragrances publicly disclosed on
Mhm.
an ingredient list, whether it was for fine fragrances or within a beauty product.
Mhm.
And it took a lot of work to get a few fragrance houses to really see that this was where the industry and consumer market was going. And sure enough, there's now, a decade plus of beauty brands. Not everyone, obviously, there's still a huge transparency issue, but those that have chosen to be transparent about their fragrance ingredients are actually doing better.
Mhm.
And that's because this is what the consumer today is demanding. So, I think, the arguments around intellectual property don't make sense if you use a helpful analogy, which is if you think of like your grandma's chocolate cake that everyone loves
Mhm.
and, it's like the secret family recipe. If you handed someone the list of the ingredients used in the chocolate cake without any of the directions of how hot the oven should be or what the measurements were,
Yeah.
people would look at that list and be like, oh, yeah, it looks like ingredients for a chocolate cake, but they're not going to be able to replicate your grandma's very special secret family recipe. And that's all we're talking about. We're not talking about the actual things that are intellectual property, are the levels that are being used, how they're mixed together, all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. And as soon as you start to put it in those terms, suddenly these industry arguments that are really old and tired start to fall flat.
Why do you think parents and more, especially mothers, have historically been such powerful catalysts for change?
I think moms have faced an unfair burden of the responsibility to try to navigate the market. And
Mhm.
so you're in a position where you both have to fiercely protect your children in the best ways that you can, but then also are still, in many cases and many families, responsible for the purchasing decisions. And so that creates a pretty big fire in a lot of people's bellies.
Mhm.
I also think women in general, like if you think back to Rachel Carson in the 1960s, she wasn't a mom, but she's a woman leader that really helped, connect the dots between pesticides and human and environmental health. Erin Brockovich in the 90s, Lois Gibbs with Love Canal. Like these are, I think women are willing to kind of buck um, they'll do anything and kind of like go against the status quo to protect their
Mhm.
kids. And I think that's one of the most amazing things about women, especially moms.
Mhm.
But I think parents at the end of the day think about the world that their children are going to inherit and
Mhm.
prioritize their time effectively. And so while moms have been certainly some of the most amazing people that I've worked with over the course of my career, and agents of change over the course of history, I also want people to understand that this is not something we should be putting on moms' plates. Like at the end of the
Mhm.
day, the chemical industry should be responsible for showing that their products are safe long before they get into any sort of formulating lab.
Yeah.
And the responsibility should be with the chemical industry, which is where state and federal regulation really come into play because we've asked moms to be their own federal agencies without the time and the training to do so properly. And I think that's unfair and it's unjust. And we need to push the burden back where it belongs, which is on the chemical industry's shoulders.
What's the best way people can help push the needle forward, basically?
I give people in the back of my book, there's a big take action section, and I
Mhm.
like to say it's a menu, not a to-do list for the
Yeah.
overachievers out there. And I have call scripts and I connect people to who's working in their state to lead these efforts at the state level. But especially as it relates to the fragrance industry, one of the best things people can do is call their federal elected officials and ask for the fragrance loophole to
Mhm.
be closed once and for all. So the fragrance loophole at the federal level is the ways that companies can hide behind fragrance or parfum on their ingredient list
Mhm.
without sharing any of that information with consumers.
Yeah.
And so if people call their federal elected officials, we can hopefully at the federal level put some helpful pressure in the same way we've been able to at the state level. And if there's anything I've learned in the last 20 years of doing this policy work, the more I do it, the more hopeful I become. So people think their voices don't matter, but I can
Mhm.
assure you, as someone who's lobbying these members of Congress and their staff, every single phone call and email really makes a difference. So again, in the back of my book, I provide a lot of different either call scripts or ways to send emails that are really simple. And I would also encourage people to be connected to organizations who are really leading this work because they're going
Mhm.
to mobilize us at key moments in time. So if
Yeah.
you think about breast cancer prevention partners, Toxic Free
Mhm.
Future, Environmental Working Group, these are all incredible resources and ways for us to kind of stay plugged into the safer beauty conversation in Washington.
And how about in the current climate right now with some rollbacks of certain policies being threatened or even happening? How do you stay hopeful and how do you think about the future and yeah.
I mean, in the last 15 months, we've seen more rollbacks, almost 20 federal laws on
Mm,
toxic chemicals rolled back, which is the most in my career, the like largest rollback I've ever seen of environmental laws, especially those related to toxic chemicals. And
mhm,
I think we need to find that fire in our belly again.
mm,
And again, I have seen time and time again when we really mobilize across the country and people take the time to say no more rollbacks to toxic chemical laws, we have had the ability to stop and prevent some of these rollbacks, or at least create enough of a political pressure that is bipartisan to say, oh, whoa, there's going to be a political price to pay
mhm,
if we touch some of these existing laws on the books. So even things that feel small but actually are pretty significant, like there was a requirement in our updates to federal cosmetic safety laws to
mhm,
require asbestos testing for talc using
Hmm.
cosmetics. That provision was rolled back. And it may seem small, but it's actually not small when you
Yeah.
look at the fact that asbestos was found in children's play makeup. I've got
Hmm.
a 5 and 7-year-old. They like to have makeup to play with,
Yeah.
and it's just unacceptable. So I think, the more people can, it doesn't cost you anything. It takes less than 2 minutes to pick up the phone, once every 3 months or so. And
Hmm.
again, mobilize when these organizations call us to, it's going to make a huge, huge impact.
Okay, I also wanted to ask you about what tools and certifications do you recommend to consumers to help them navigate safer products? Because we're obviously not all chemists.
Yes, I'll give you four,
Mhm.
because not all certifications are created equal.
Yep.
The EWG Verified is the most credible science-based certification for the beauty and fragrance industry. Made Safe Certified covers a lot of different product categories, including beauty and personal care, but
Mhm.
it covers mattresses and household cleaners. They're exceptional. Clean Label Project for supplements and protein powders. They're testing for contaminants like heavy
Mhm.
metals, pesticide residues, and then Okiotech certification for fabrics. And so I give more certification recommendations in my book, Cleaning House, but those are my
Mhm.
favorites. And in general, outside of the use of the Skin Deep database, I find most of the consumer apps don't get the science right.
Right.
So I really like Clearia, which is a browser extension. I think they do a nice job. For the most part, though, other apps like the Yucca app or Think Dirty app don't quite get it right. And I think they're
Mhm.
well intended, but
Yep.
don't necessarily drive the right consumer behavior for brands that are really doing the best work.
For consumers that do feel overwhelmed, how can they begin to think about this without falling into perfectionism?
I think, it's easy once people learn about this issue to become obsessed with trying to make the best decisions in their home. And I tell people you can't shop your way to safety. And you could read that as something that feels depressing, like, oh, I don't have control.
Hmm.
Or what I encourage people to do is to think about it in the opposite way, which is this isn't entirely on my shoulders.
Hmm.
So I really encourage people to focus on a few priority chemicals and areas in your home to
Hmm.
make smart decisions about, save up for if you need to like buy a new couch or new mattress. These like key inflection points and really priority product areas, and then let go of the rest. And what that will do is it will prevent burnout. It will prevent the perfectionism trap, which
Hmm.
isn't really backed by science anyway.
Yep.
And it will create the space for people to still work on the most important way to affect change, which is through this systemic change. And that's either supporting companies that are doing the right work, like yourself, or through picking up the phone or sending an email to your members of Congress. So I think, the really focusing on 70% of those exposures in your home. And I have a chart in the back of my book that people can use is the
Hmm.
best way to really approach this. And, also kind of like let your kids off the hook. A lot of people ask me, your parents, like, how do you handle when your child goes to a birthday party or something like that? And they bring home a gift that you don't like. And I just let it go. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Like they get bored with those gifts anyway. And, um, we have and can also trust our bodies to help, in some cases, like certain things like hormone disrupting chemicals like BPA or phthalates, they actually leave our body quite quickly within
Mhm.
24 to 48 hours. And so you can trust your body as well to have it and rely on its natural detoxification pathways.
Thank you so much. This was such a thoughtful conversation. I really appreciate all the work that you've done over the years, and also the nuance that you bring to this topic. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. And for anyone watching, I really recommend her book, Cleaning House. I will put a link to the book. Thank you for your time. Lovely to speak to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the great work you're doing.